Hello, Theo 1004, Interpreting the New Testament module at the University of Nottingham. Welcome to this week when we'll be talking about what we call the Deuteropauline or the disputed Pauline epistles and the pastoral epistles. So the last topic we touched upon was Paul, and these 7 letters that everyone agrees were written by Paul, who was a really influential, very early figure in the Jesus movement. In fact, so early that his writings are from before the destruction of the temple. Some of the earliest, if not the earliest, Jesus following writings that exist. But this week we'll be talking about writings that some of them claim to be written by Paul, but people don't think they were written by Paul, but they either have Paul's name associated with them or people thought at one time they were written by Paul. So we'll be talking about those. But before we had this lecture, I gave you a sort of solo workshop. So I gave you a primary text workshop where you had to look at excerpts from authentic Pauline epistles, from disputed Pauline epistles, from other later epistles, and I asked you to hone in specifically and look for the view of the body, the view of sexuality and marriage in all of these excerpts. And I asked you to try and detect, did these seem like they're written by the same person? Did they seem like the idea is developing? Do they even seem like some of the ideas are clashing and disputing one another? What's going on there? And I didn't give you any answers. I just gave you questions and gave you some time to reflect. And so this lecture will sort of be the spoiler alert to what was going on in that workshop. And this lecture very much goes in tandem with chapter 25 of your textbook by Bart Ehrman. So it will make a lot more sense if you do your reading and the workshop and listen to this video. We've been coming back over and over to this kind of bookshelf image throughout the whole semester. And so this time, here we are again looking at all of the books that are in green. And the green books are epistles that are in the Pauline tradition. That means that they're somehow associated with Paul, or they were at one point, but it doesn't mean that they were all written by Paul. So as you know, this is color-coded. So the books that have a little gold or yellow stripe on the trim, those are known as the authentic Paulines or the undisputed Pauline epistles. And there are 7 undisputed epistles that scholars all agree were written before the destruction of the temple by Paul. And they are Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon, which you read a couple weeks ago. That's not the order in which they were written, but it's the order in which they were placed in the canon. Now, there are other green books that have a gray star. Forgive the graphics, I made it with Microsoft Paint, so, you know, not the fanciest, but the books with the gray star, Ephesians, Colossians, 2nd Thessalonians, Titus, 1st and 2nd Timothy, are all disputed in some way. The ones with just the star are absolutely not thought to be written by Paul, by scholars. But the ones with the star plus the red dot are disputed. So people make arguments for and against within scholarship. So both your textbook chapter for this week, which was chapter 25 of Ehrman, called In the Wake of the Apostle, and your primary text workshop from Monday talk about how Paul's writings, Paul's thought, Paul's influence, and the idea of Paul's authority lived on after his death, and how those things were taken in different directions, and sometimes they veered into very conflicted directions. People disagreed over what Paul said, disagreed over whether what Paul said was right, and disagreed over whether what Paul had said before was still useful in their time, you know, several decades or almost a century later. So scholars call this reception history. That is, the study of how something has been received in later times. The reception of Paul is especially fascinating because he's still being received and interpreted today, because he made it into the Bible of a major world religion at this point. However, even from his earliest reception, Paul was already being adapted, disputed, manipulated, imitated, and refuted in order to serve the aims and the needs of each recipient community. And we see some of that tension of Pauline reception right within the New Testament texts themselves. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about letters that actually claim to be written by Paul, but very likely were not. So what is a pseudonym? A pseudonym is like a pen name. So if you want to, like when J.K. Rowling was finished with the Harry Potter series and wanted to start writing, adult mystery stories, she used a pseudonym. She used a pen name for various reasons. For example, maybe she wanted those novels to be taken for their own merit and not only purchased because they were by a famous writer. She wanted to see if they would do well without people knowing that it was by J.K. Rowling, author of Harry Potter. Pseudepigraphy is kind of like the use of a pen name, but it's a specific term that's used for scholars of early Judaism and early Christianity, because it's something that was practiced by Jews before Christianity even existed, and by Jews and Jewish Christians after Christianity was born. It's the practice of creating new written works under the name of a deceased but esteemed person. Sometimes this is done by people who see themselves in the tradition of that person. It's almost a way of honoring them or carrying forward the good work that they have done. So your textbook sort of sees pseudepigraphy quite negatively as a kind of forgery, but as a scholar of early Judaism, I want to add that it wasn't necessarily viewed negatively. The ways in which people viewed forgery and pseudepigraphy in antiquity are varied, and so it's not necessarily some kind of negative trickster lying and faking. It could also be seen as, like, yes, a valuable way of lending authority of a great person in the past to a new thing which the writer also thinks is great and is helpful. So pseudepigraphy preceded Christian writings, and a famous example of pseudepigraphy is the book of 1st Enoch, which is a Hellenistic text that's presented as the work of that Enoch that appeared, before Noah in Genesis. The text of 1st Enoch was very popular. It was accepted and respected enough in the first 2 centuries to make its way into the New Testament, quoted as scripture. The book of Jude quotes 1st Enoch 1:9. It's referred to by the writer of the letter of Barnabas as scripture, and it's just quite prolific in its manuscript tradition and was definitely highly regarded. But of course, we don't know this for sure, but many of the recipients would know that this text was not really written by that Enoch, and that was okay for them somehow. So pseudepigraphy is pseudonymity, but specifically in early Jewish tradition. In fact, there's a 2-volume work called, it's a bit of a Christian-centric name, the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha, edited by James Charlesworth. And that is a collection of all kinds of amazing early Jewish writings that now you can find online if you want to read ancient primary texts written by Jews around the Second Temple period. You can find it online at earlyjewishwritings.com. But the quote-unquote Old Testament pseudepigrapha are an amazing array of Jewish writings, many of which are actual pseudepigrapha, which means they claim to be written by a great hero of old, but they were actually written not in the ancient Near East, but in kind of Hellenistic times. So that's pseudonymity and pseudepigraphy. So your textbook talks about this strong word, forgery. Forgery in the New Testament. Is this a problem? Well, for scholars, no. But for some Christians for whom the New Testament forms their Bible and their sacred text, specific types of Christians find this very distressing. Oh my gosh, the Bible is lying. My entire faith has exploded. So hopefully through the course of this lecture, you will not see it that way as something that needs to necessarily explode your entire faith. So let's address this. Forgery in the New Testament, as your textbook calls it. Were all the letters in the New Testament written by the persons whose name is now attached to them? Tradition says yes. Most people who attend a church will not hear a sermon that says, you know, in this pseudo-Pauline epistle, we read blah, blah, blah. I mean, you might see that in more mainline traditions that kind of flow easily between kind of a scholarly view, academic view, and their faith perspective. But generally, in a Christian church, you won't hear questions about authorship. You won't hear the minister call the books of Luke, Acts, the book written by the author we now know as Luke. You'll just hear them call the gospel authors Luke, Matthew, and Mark. You won't say the author of Mark as though the person isn't known. But the truth is the author of the Gospels isn't known. So tradition says that all of the letters in the New Testament are written by whoever they say they're written by. But critical scholarship, those are not the findings of critical scholars. We have two kind of sets of post-Pauline epistles. One we call the pastoral epistles, the pastorals. These are 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. So when you hear people say, oh, in the pastoral epistles, blah, 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 they're talking about 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And why are they called pastoral? Well, it's because they're written to they're written more generally to leaders of multiple communities. They're really for organized leadership. And the other letters that fall into this category that your textbook author calls forgery are what we call the Deuteropaulines or the disputed Pauline epistles. So those are Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians. 2 Thessalonians is probably the most unknown. There are really solid debates on both sides for whether or not Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians, but there's no consensus, so it falls into this category of disputed. Colossians and Ephesians, it's a bit more solid that scholars don't think these were written by Paul for a number of reasons that your textbook goes into and that we'll also go into. So what are some of the clues inside the New Testament that the people at the time kind of knew that falsely attributed or false claims about authorship were already going around at the time? We actually see evidence right in the New Testament that this was kind of an issue for people. For example, in the book of Galatians, Paul writes, I write to you, see the large letters with which I write to you in my own hand, which means that while dictating a letter to his secretary, let's call it, Paul took the writing materials and wrote in his own hand, which he says is really big. So maybe he's not scribally trained like the person who was doing the actual penmanship. So Galatians 6:11 is an example of Paul trying to put a stamp of authenticity on the letter of Galatians, because he already knew at that point other people are making different claims and I want to really show them this is me. We also see in 2 Thessalonians, which, if you'll recall, is one of the disputed letters, Listen to this. As to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered together to him, we beg you, brothers and sisters, not to be quickly shaken in mind or alarmed, either by spirit or by word or by letter, as though from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord is already here. Let no one deceive you in any way. So right within that letter, which we think might be a kind of forgery, the author is already saying, like, we kind of know that there are forgeries. There could be a letter that says it's from us, but it isn't. Don't listen to it. So that's a bit meta. And if you read your textbook, you'll see other examples from antiquity of letters that we know are forgeries that are saying you really need to be careful about forgeries. But we know that they are forgeries, so the authors were pretty savvy. So the three disputed letters, the disputed Paulines or the pseudo-Paulines, 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, and Ephesians. What are the arguments against Pauline authorship in these letters? There are a whole bunch, and some of them are in your textbook, and some of them are on these slides, and there are more. But the ones I want to highlight for you right now are, 1, the view of the eschaton. So the view in the letters of the end of time, or whether it had already begun, whether it was imminent or totally unknown, stuff like that. We've already talked about historical Jesus scholarship and Paul's view that both Jesus and Paul were what we call apocalyptic Jews, which was a minority stream within Second Temple Judaism of those who felt convinced that time was linear and happened in certain stages and ages, and that they were living in the very last age, and the end would come very soon in the form of an apocalypse, a very cataclysmic end that would usually involve a battle, whether literal or spiritual or both. And so we have lots and lots of internal and external evidence for Jesus and Paul being apocalyptic Jews who believed the end was like tomorrow. But they're tomorrow. So when we look through early Christian texts and try to pinpoint a date for them, we often see that texts that we know are later, like 2nd century, or the turn of the 2nd century, kind of move away from saying that the end is tomorrow. Probably because people in the early Jesus movement had begun to die. So they had to let go of their belief that not one person would die before the end. So when a whole generation had died, at that point, early Christians had to say, actually, we don't know when the end is, and it might be far away. So now we have to focus on this life and living in community and set up some community rules. It's not the crazy end of times anymore, where slaves eat at the same table as their masters, where there is no male and female, there is no Jew and non-Jew. We actually have to fit back into normal society here. Those are the kinds of things we see in 2nd century writings. So 1, the eschaton, the view of the eschaton. Is it still being very eagerly awaited? Is there an urgency? Are social norms kind of all falling away? Or is the eschaton moved off into an indefinite future? Is it much more amorphous? Secondly, perhaps related to this, is look for the role of women in letters. Generally, in general, they move from a prominent role in the earliest Jesus following texts to fast forward 100 years to women being pushed into a less prominent role, fast forward 200 years into women almost being connected with the devil and viewed negatively. That oversimplifies it, but scholars of gender in the Second Temple period kind of see a bit of a blossoming for women around in the late Republic, which Jesus and Paul were a part of, and then a clampdown on women that turned quite nasty in a matter of 100 or 200 years. So the role of women. In the Jesus movement, like in many apocalyptic movements, social norms can be disrupted if you think the end is really near. So women in the earliest Jesus movement has much more important roles, leadership roles. Paul is our earliest evidence for early Jesus communities, and he inherited a movement that already had many women in all kinds of very important roles. They were there before him. He inherited them as people who were patrons, deaconesses, apostles, etc., etc. All these terms were, Paul received a community that had women filling all these roles. But then, as the movement kind of settles into an established institution, these roles diminish. So if you're looking at an epistle and you're trying to gauge date and authorship, and you see like a strong diminishing of women's roles, almost on purpose, a focus on diminishing the role of women, that's going to be a later, very likely a later text, very likely 2nd century. Thirdly, the institutional situation. Is there kind of a church already? Is there a hierarchy in place? Are there defined offices? If so, this is a red flag that this is a later letter, after there's been time to begin to break from Judaism and break from like a synagogue system into what would eventually become a new world religion. So if we already see kind of an established hierarchy, well, the time of Paul before the temple was even destroyed is it's too early for that. Everyone is still in relationship to Judaism at that point. Christianity wasn't a separate thing, so institutional hierarchy and defined offices are another example of something that makes us flag up 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, and Ephesians as non-Pauline. And finally, for some people, the biggest reason why these 3 letters and others are not considered Pauline is the simple vocabulary, the question of vocabulary. Are there words that are key concepts to Paul that don't appear at all in these writings? Are there new concepts in the disputed letters that don't sound like something Paul was on about? Does the very writing style itself in Greek sound like Paul? And in the case of these 3 letters, no, not really. So that's another reason why. Now let's talk about those letters we call the pastoral epistles. Why are they called this? They got this title from early times because they deal with pastoral matters. They deal with church organization and church leadership. These are the only letters in the New Testament that are actually addressed to pastors, to kind of shepherds of communities, so to speak, in charge over other Christians, rather than like when we see the letters of Paul addressed to the communities, almost like they're his communities. But 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are addressed to overseers of communities, or even of over more than one community. Ostensibly, these are addressed to Timothy, the pastor at Ephesus, and to Titus, a pastor over the Crete area, on how to deal with community problems. So that's kind of the setup for these letters, known as the Pastorals. So why do people date the Pastorals quite some time after the death of Paul? Number one, like I said for the disputed Paulines, a different apocalyptic sensibility. Once again, we know that Paul was preoccupied with keeping the faith while waiting for an imminent return of Christ in the parousia, or the eschaton, the end, the general resurrection. But the pastorals are not preoccupied with that. In fact, they're preoccupied with social arrangements and mores within churches. In other words, churches who see themselves as being around for a long time, indefinitely. And they're also concerned with the respectability of Christians in the eyes of the outside world, making sure that Christians look like upright, upstanding citizens, much like the author of Luke Acts is doing, trying to make Christians look very palatable to Romans and to distance Christians from groups like those who battled Rome in the war between Jews and Rome that resulted in the destruction of the temple. So Luke Acts is one of the later Gospels around the turn of the century into the second, and likewise the Disputed Paulines and the Pastorals are also concerned with making early Christianity look really good to Romans. Secondly, as I mentioned with the Disputed Paulines, the Pastorals have a different idea of Christian family. In your workshop on primary texts, you saw that in authentic Pauline writing, he doesn't come out and say, don't get married or divorce your partner, but he's not positive about marriage. He is not enthusiastic about marriage. He comes out and says, celibacy is better. I wish you could all be like me. And that's probably, again, because of the imminent end time. The end of the world is coming. Don't bother yourself with romance, with relationships, with children, with anything like that because of the urgency of the end. But the Pastorals are the opposite. They zone in on marriage and childbearing as very, very important, to the point of saying women will be saved through childbearing. I feel as though if Paul saw that line, he would say, me genoita in Greek, like heaven forbid, let it not be, because Paul was so concerned with salvation being through grace. Grace only, not any kind of action, whether it's circumcision or whether it's like this or that ritual activity, this or that belief. Paul is really interested in salvation coming through grace. Paul would never write, women will be saved through childbearing. It is an antithesis to what authentic Paul said. He was very adamant about connecting salvation with grace, God's grace through Christ, and B, he was not a fan of marriage and childbearing. He tolerated it at best. But the Pastorals are very interested in kind of Roman family values. C, number 3. Like I said before, there's a different implicit time frame. The Pastorals assume that Timothy is a third-generation Christian. It talks about his mother and his grandmother, who were both also Christians. That alone implies the passage of time between Paul, who was first generation, and the Pastorals, who are kind of third generation. So they internally imply that they are written at a later time. And like with the Disputed Paulines, the Pastorals have a very different view of women. Paul acknowledged so many women by name: Chloe, Junia, Lydia, Priscilla, but the Pastorals seem intent on reducing and restricting the role and importance of women. There is a passage within the Undisputed Paulines in Corinthians that has specific guidelines for a kind of, for when women are prophesying, they should do so in a very orderly manner. There's something going on in the community at Corinth, but that's the only time when Paul kind of gives a restriction to women. Otherwise, he is quite shockingly gender egalitarian. So yes, big difference in the way the Pastorals view women. And finally, like with the disputed Paulines, the pastorals have evidence of a structure, a church structure. Paul mentions overseers and deacons, which is the Greek word for servant, in Philippians 1:1. But by the time of the pastoral letters, there seems to be a flourishing kind of knowledge of a rigid hierarchical structure that goes bishop, presbyters, and deacons. And presbyteros, presbyter is a Greek word for an old person, but it seems to start to be being used in a more technical sense in the pastorals. Another reason why people think that they're much later than Paul. And next, once again, the pastorals are written in a different language. They have specific concerns and vocabulary that we see across second century texts. People do these calculations and they vary a little bit, but one person's calculation is there are 848 words used in the pastoral letters, total vocab, not including people's names. Out of those words, a full 306 of them are just not words that are used in the Pauline corpus. Not even in Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians, the disputed Paulines. So therefore, over 1/3 of the vocabulary of the pastorals is not found in Paul. That cluster of words, however, are very well known in other second century texts. So they really call out for a dating in the 2nd century. Which brings us to something called scholarly consensus. Most things in the world, even really obvious things like that the earth is not flat, never achieve 100% consensus. But when we say scholarly consensus, we mean so many different types of scholars over such a period of time have all agreed for various different reasons on something, to the point where in an intro university class, this thing will be taught and has to be taught. That's what we call scholarly consensus. So the consensus of biblical scholars, for all the reasons I mentioned and other reasons that you can find in your textbook reading, confidently consider the pastoral letters, so 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, to be pseudonymous. And this is not a scholarly debate. It's not an open debate. It's closed. That is uncomfortable for some of you, I know. Christians down through time, even before there was a New Testament, early Jesus followers, before any New Testament texts were written even, have always had a wide range of views on which texts are sacred and what does it mean if a text is sacred. And is the collection closed or is it open for additions? This is something that's wildly diverse in the Second Temple period, including for early Jesus followers. But then continuing that diversity after there came early Christian texts and after the New Testament canon was closed, this wide range of views of what should be included, which texts are more important, if they contradict, which one do you prefer, what does a sacred text mean, what's the canon for, all of those things are there's no consensus on them, and we see a wide spectrum of different views toward them. But around the late 1500s, and especially in the early 1600s, some Christians, after the Reformation, and probably due to strong Catholic Protestant polemics that were happening at this time, came up with a view of the Bible as inerrant. So the Council of Trent was one place where Christians developed a view of the Bible as inspired in a certain way, which means it could only contain truth, which kind of is up for debate. And then Protestants developed this idea of biblical almost infallibility or inerrancy. And since that time, some Christians have had a view of the Bible that it can't, it's almost not a human document. It's kind of a miraculous document that cannot contradict itself and must be accurate in every way, including literally accurate. And so that is a minority view. It's a kind of a fringe view, but it's specifically very popular in the United States, but it does exist in different kinds of Christianity all over the world. For people who hold that view, the notion that there could be a pseudonymous letter in the Bible, it doesn't work for them. They can't entertain that idea. That means that the findings of critical scholarship contradict their religious beliefs. And so what do you do when that happens? That's really hard for people. It's really hard to step outside your worldview and accept kind of a different set of evidence, a different set of criteria for evaluating evidence, and different assumptions. But that is what happens at university for everyone who goes through a liberal arts or a humanities degree will be challenged by having to hold for a time a different worldview in your hands and try it on. And so for those who cannot even allow themselves to think about the concept of a book in the New Testament being pseudonymous, there are books that use the language of critical biblical scholarship to argue for the authenticity of all of the epistles, including the Pastorals. But just so you know, if you find them, those books are sort of by insiders for insiders. So they're not used by critical scholars, but they're written for people inside that set of assumptions that are unable to allow themselves to even think about things in the Bible being pseudonymous or given a name later, but we don't really know who wrote them, or written by for a specific community need at a certain time. All of those things disrupt the idea of biblical inerrancy, which it's hard when that happens. So, but to hold views like that, to hold the view that Paul wrote every single one of the books that are in green on our bookshelf image, to hold those views, you have to deal with the following. You have to deal with the fact that Paul's undisputed epistles were all written to small communities, sort of meeting in someone's house, one community at a time, sort of his communities that he was visiting, traveling around visiting. But the pastorals are written to kind of leaders in charge of many churches, more established churches. Secondly, you have to deal with the fact that the church in these letters is somehow an institution, whereas in the undisputed Paulines, the church is a part of Judaism, groups of Jesus followers who are somehow attached to synagogues. They include non-Jews, but that's a big deal. It's a big deal. It's a big bone of contention. It's something that they're working out between the Jerusalem faction and Paul. It's being worked out with some distress. Whereas in the Pastorals and the Deuteropaulines, it's like non-Jews are not an issue. It's almost assumed that that's not as important. So right there, that's a huge difference. Thirdly, if Paul wrote the Pastorals, it means that he underwent a dramatic change in vocabulary and in his very writing style. He began to write very, very differently, right down to grammar, vocabulary, and like ability. Fourthly, and this is the most difficult, he changed his theology. You would have to argue that maybe over time he really changed his mind on a number of things. About salvation, for example. He went through a complete reversal of his treatment of women. He went through a complete reversal of his view of the eschaton being imminent. He went through a complete reversal of his view of asceticism. So undisputed Paulines are moderately ascetic, at least pro-asceticism, in favor of celibacy if at all possible. Deuteropaulines and Pastorals are adamantly against, actively, vocally against asceticism. There are also in the Pastorals and Deuteropaulines some concerns that we see prolifically across literature of the 2nd century rather than the 1st. And one of them is, you know this from looking at sort of the lecture on the Johannine epistles and other things that were written around that time, and developing kind of Gnostic Christianity, very different kinds of Christianity growing up. The notion of false teachers is a super hot 2nd century topic, hot topic. So when you see letters in the New Testament that bring the term false teachers into play, an assumption is, sounds like 2nd century, so that it flags up that it's a later development. Secondly, another 2nd century concern is internal organization of communities. No longer is this an apocalyptic kind of mindset where it's like social mores are out the window and it's all topsy-turvy because the end is imminent. It's more like, how are we going to find our place? There's no temple, so there's no kind of relationship via a sort of half Roman sellout group of like the Herods or the priestly authorities who kind of mediate with Rome. There's none of that. There is no temple, and it's not coming back. The communities are largely no longer Jewish or very mixed, not starting to not identify as Jewish. All of that kind of stuff is happening. That is a 2nd century concern. That's by no means a concern that happened around the time of Paul before the temple was even destroyed. We're looking at a clampdown on women playing important roles in assemblies, whereas in the 1st century they were teaching, they were going out in the early Jesus movement doing missionary activity, they were performing readings like Chloe delivering Paul's letter, they were definitely prophesying. Paul gives instructions on what they should wear when they prophesy and pray in the assembly. There's all kinds of ideas about women prophets. They were hosts, they were patrons. Paul calls one of them an apostle. This is 1st century women. 2nd century is when we see injunctions against women in any other role besides submissive, silent, subservient, child rearing, basically. That's not a 1st century, it's not typical of the 1st century. It's typical of a big shift that happened in the 2nd century for women. So 1 Timothy and Titus are instructions on church life and Christian life in the home. They reinforce Roman ideas, Roman socially conservative ideas about the place of women, about the place of slaves, about respect for authority. These are not concerns of a community that thinks the end is coming and Rome is about to get it. These are concerns of a community that must live on under Rome. Note that the writer who's cast as Paul talks to Timothy in 2 Timothy 1:6 about the laying on of hands. That is not something that we know from the Pauline epistles that are undisputed that Paul received. These kind of institutional stamps of approval. In fact, Paul kind of spent some time and effort repudiating of kind of official recognitions. So for all kinds of reasons, the pastoral epistles scream out 100 years after Paul. So that is sort of my reading of your textbook, but I would really like you to also read chapter 25. It goes into a lot more detail. It gives lots of primary text examples from inside and outside the New Testament canon. So please read chapter 25. It's called In the Wake of the Apostle, the Deuteropauline and Pastoral Epistles. It's absolutely key. Secondly, if you haven't done so already, go through the primary text workshop slides. It's like a solo workshop. It's close reading of ancient texts, looking for the view of marriage and the body and sexuality in the text. Thirdly, these slides. And if you have time, this is optional, but if you have time, just open up your New Testament and go through various epistles, thinking about chronology, thinking about the ones that we know the date of. For example, Undisputed Paulines, we know they're pre-70. Look through some of those, and then look through Titus and Timothy. Look through the Disputed Paulines. Try to gauge just from the English translation or the contents whether, if you didn't know anything about this, if they didn't have a name on them, would you think they were from the same person? Maybe you would. If so, why? And if you wouldn't, then why not? What were the red flags for you that there were different authors? That's the best way to become a New Testament scholar, is just read those ancient texts, not in little snippets, but the whole book at a time, ideally out loud, which is kind of my, like in my dream world, you would all read like the whole book out loud, but I recognize that my dreams may not all come true. All right, that's enough for now. I'm looking forward to having a real-time chat in our Moodle chat room shortly. Bye, everyone.